our Banned Books Week webinar today. My name's Franco. I'm a board member at large with the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable. A brief welcome, and then we'll kick it to our panelists today for today's discussion and webinar. Give me just a moment while I get a slide up on the screen, and then we'll get going. All right. So, as I said, welcome to our Banned Books Week webinar series featuring comics creators and librarians in conversation on topics centered around censorship and intellectual freedom. These webinars are offered in partnership between ALA Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable, ALA Intellectual Freedom Roundtable, and with our friends at Image Comics. All webinars are being recorded and will be made available online on the GNCRT website at ala.org/RT/GNCRT at a later date, probably sometime within the next week or two. So if you want to revisit this webinar or share it with anyone else who might be interested, you'll be able to do that. In addition to these webinars, you can also participate in Banned Books Week through Escape the Dead End of Censorship, a virtual escape room where you can demonstrate your knowledge of intellectual freedom. You can access the escape room at tinyurl.com/IFRT-BBW2020, just like the year 2020, and you can see that link up on your screen now. You can also let the world know that you love comics and support the freedom to read them with GNCRT and IFRT tech tattoos that can be affixed to your laptop, tablet, or phone to proudly display your support for the work of our roundtables. Tech tattoos can be purchased on the Freedom to Read Foundation store at ftrf.org/store. And you can see that link and an image of the tech tattoos that are available. I will say that I have them on my computer right now, and they are super handy, especially for covering the camera when you are not on a Zoom webinar like right now. If you have any questions for today's panelists, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring questions throughout the webinar and have some time set aside at the end for questions from all of you. And then I will kick it to Brandy to introduce today's panel and panelists.
All right, thanks, Franco. So our panel today is called Comics. Are These Real Books? And our panelist and moderator will be in conversation on why comics so often wind up on annual most challenged book lists, what comics are most often challenged, and what you can do to overcome negative opinions of comics. So let me introduce our panelist and our moderator. Charles Soule is a Brooklyn, New York-based novelist, comic book writer, musician, and attorney. While he has worked for DC and other publishers, he is best known for writing Daredevil, She-Hulk, Death of Wolverine, and various Star Wars comics from Marvel Comics, including Darth Vader, Poe Dameron, Lando, and more, and his creator-owned series Curse Words with Ryan Brown, and Undiscovered Country with Scott Snyder and Giuseppe Camuncoli from Image Comics, as well as Letter 44 with Alberto Jimenez Albuquerque from Oni Press. His first novel, The Oracle Year, was published by the Harper Perennial imprint of HarperCollins in 2018. His second novel, Anyone, was released on December 3rd, 2019, everywhere. So welcome, Charles. Hello. And our moderator today is Matthew Noe. He is a collection management librarian and part-time instructor in his working life, a specialist in graphic medicine, and an avid reader of nearly anything he can get his hands on. He is currently the president-elect of ALA's Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable, treasurer of Graphic Medicine International Collective, and a 2020 ALA Emerging Leader. You can often find him screaming about all manner of things on Twitter. So thanks, Matthew, for moderating today, and I'm going to kick it over to Matthew to get our conversation started.
Thanks, Brandy. Hi, Charles.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Zooming again.
Yep. It never ends.
Yeah.
Sorry to everybody for this weird glare. I have tried like 4 different ways to get rid of it. It's not going away today. So I'm just going to dive right in. That way we have time for questions later. So as you know, we're celebrating Banned Book Week. And really often, surprisingly, comics wind up on these lists. Most notably, drama by Raina Telgemeier, this one Summer, And then you've got, for me, the weird one of the week has been Bone, like Jeff Smith's Bone. Why is this on? And but you've also worked in publishing novels too. So working in both mediums, like, do you have any thoughts on why comics might show up more often than novels in these top 10 lists?
Absolutely. I mean, I think comics are an art form that, you know, even today, like it's a reputation that's sort of undeserved at this point, because there's so much graphic content that is produced for you know, grown-up readers. But I still think comics, particularly superhero comics, are just seen as something that younger readers experience. And as you and I both know, that what's actually produced in comics is a vast spectrum of material, from all kinds of things to the most intense, very, very mature material to, you know, to like Bone, which is pretty inoffensive and wonderful. So, and is appropriate for, you know, the youngest readers, I think. A little scary sometimes, but still wonderful. So I think what happens is, not every parent, but some parents are just like, oh, my kid's reading some comics, whatever. And then, you know, kids will kind of explore where the river of stories goes for them. And they maybe will happen upon a, you know, I'm not going to single out any, but let's say, like, I don't know, the Punisher is a character that is very well known and has had runs that have been more intense than others. And so, you know, a parent or a caregiver or a you know, an authority figure, teacher, whatever, might happen upon a comic that has a pretty intense scene in it and be like, wow, I thought this stuff was fine. And it turns out that they are experiencing content that I should have introduced them to or chosen for them. And I think that probably happens a lot, because, like I said, once you sort of dip into the river of comics, it can take you to some really interesting places, which I think is amazing for readers and of all ages to experience. But I know that, like, parents might sort of think of it as, or again, caregivers, authority figures, whatever, might think of comics as sort of inoffensive or with material that is age appropriate, and then they sort of get shocked by it, and then they react the way that people will react. And unfortunately, the reaction is, instead of sort of working with the material, it's just to say, okay, let's get rid of it. Let's make sure that they can't see it. So.
Yeah, for sure. You kind of answered my second question already a little bit. So I was going to ask you, like, many of these comics are, you know, intended for kids. And, you know, what are the reasons, some of the reasons behind this, and how can we better support children in self-selecting the books they read then? If their parents are a little concerned, like, do you have any thoughts on how we can?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the kids, most, not all, but comics are expensive, right? And so the kids that I know who read comics found them through their library, you know, right? Like, libraries have fantastically well-stocked graphic novel sections most of the time. And the librarians who run those sections tend to know what they're doing. And, you know, there's, they will separate those comics into, it's not just one big blob of comics. Like, they separate them out, and librarians being librarians, if an 8-year-old comes and tries to bring them, I don't know, like Preacher, which is again, a really, really wonderful comic, but it's not appropriate for most 8-year-olds, I would say. And that's, you know, I hope we will get to the point of, like, how these standards come into effect and how different communities approach the idea of content, because it's really interesting to think about. But in terms of that, I think libraries are just a massive thing, because they are by their nature curated. You know, libraries do not stock every single book. And so there are librarians who read stuff and be like, or read about things in the reviews and newsletters that you guys all share, and say, well, I think this is something that my you know, readership at my library would like. My clients, customers. How do librarians refer to the people who come into their libraries?
Oh, that's like the third rail, like trying to define comics.
Yeah.
I prefer the term patrons.
Patrons, perfect. Yeah. That's perfect. So the patrons, you know, of whatever age, like, you know, if a 15-year-old comes over with Preacher, well, that might be different than an 8-year-old coming over with Preacher. So I think that's one way for sure. I think, you know, whether it's video games, whether it's TV shows, movies, comics, music, like, if you want to have a role in the pace at which your child experiences like anything in their life, right? If you, any kind of content, then you need to actually do that. And I think that that requires being informed, that requires, you know, trying to understand. And it also requires, I really think, a little bit of letting go, and understanding that you might be able to guide your child and instill in them a sense of, you know, these are the stories that I think are okay for you. And if you move forward, like I have a daughter, she's 14, and we've had this discussion because she's, you know, she has the internet available to her now. I mean, she has had her whole life. But whether it's Netflix or, you know, a Kindle or whatever the way she's able to access stories or the library, like she knows that she can get stuff and she can stumble on things that she doesn't feel like she's ready for. And so the way I described it to her was like, you can't unsee things, you know, like you can only, like, for me, the big thing that really like kind of like the filmed entertainment that kind of, you know, snapped me in half a little bit was a Clockwork Orange. Like I was not ready for a Clockwork Orange when I saw it at all. I don't know that anybody is really ready for a Clockwork Orange the first time they see it, but I told her about how I felt before I saw it and after I saw it. And I wish that I had taken a few more years before I saw that movie. And, you know, and I said, you're going to make decisions, you're going to make choices, you're going to do whatever you want to do. But whenever I tell you you're not ready for something, it's just because I don't want you to have that feeling too fast. You know, I don't want you to sort of step away from the way you feel about stories now. And so it was an interesting conversation, and she got it, and she's kind of like, okay, you know, I'm gonna, you know, find the stories I want to find, but it, you know, she understands that if I'm giving her guidance, it's not because I don't want her to experience cool stories. It's that there's this sort of wall that once you get over it, you can't really ever go back to the other side of it. So that was my experience. And that's how I've done it. But I think different people will certainly do it different ways. But I just think it's about being involved and understanding. I certainly think that like putting stories in cages is ridiculous. You know, like every story has a place.
It's actually, every story has a place is actually pretty close to one of our, we've got these like Ranganathan's 5 laws of librarianship, and one's like every book its reader, and every reader its book.
Yeah.
So like, there's something for everyone, and every story is going to be good for someone. It just may not be you. So that you kind of came close to this, and it was touched on a little earlier in the week with one of the other banned book webinars, with question about like age rating systems. And with comics, it's pretty, there is no like established standard like there are for movies. And a lot of times, you also kind of alluded, librarian workers can't read everything.
Sure.
So we rely a lot on what the publisher provides and on reviews. Do you have any guidance for navigating that landscape for library workers, knowing that publishers don't always make it the most explicit? Most are good about it, but not everyone.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's true. What I would say is that, you know, get a feel for the type of content that a given publisher puts out. So Marvel, so I've done a lot of work for Marvel and DC, and they know that they're sensitive to the idea that their content is going to be consumed by younger readers. And so they definitely have an age rating system that I think they err on the side of caution when it comes to rating their books. So if you see a book that is rated T+, which is where a lot of the superhero comics land, then it's probably fine for, you know, a sophisticated 8 to 10-year-old, but maybe not. Maybe they say damn or hell or things like that, or words, you know, but you can be pretty confident with that. But if you're looking at a book by some of the more indie publishers who are also phenomenal, again, every story has its place. So like, you know, Boom or Image or Dynamite or, you know, Oni Press that I've done a lot of work for, like they put out content that can be more advanced. And so I think if you're a librarian and you're not sure, because there's thousands of comics, I think it's worth looking at it from a publisher perspective and saying, okay, well, Image books, some are younger readers and some are not, and they can be all over the map. And if I'm going to be recommending Image books, I should maybe really do my homework on those. If it's Marvel and DC, you can pretty much rely on the age rating. Again, if it's Boom or like Zenescope or Avatar, like there are companies that definitely lean more into the sort of mature readers material. So that's really the best guidance I have is sort of, because there aren't that many comics publishers that probably are going to make it into libraries. There's probably 10 to 20 that you would need to be aware of. And you know, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, thanks. Completely, it's sort of a different turn. Library workers often report overhearing patrons, sometimes our parents and caregivers, telling children to select a quote unquote real book, not a comic. Any thoughts or any tips on overcoming that attitude?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to overcome it is to have parents read comics and understand, especially the really good ones, right? Like, you know, I mean, there's like David Mazzucchelli did a book, I believe Asterios Polyp,
yeah,
right, which is like the idea that that's not a real book is ludicrous. The idea that you know, there's so many that are just, and not even within the sort of fantasy superhero genre. Like there's just March, you know, that's an incredible story that like everyone should read it. Mouse, you know, like there's just an endless series of significant literature that is told through graphic storytelling. So I think that's the first thing, is to get some parents to read, you know, to read some stuff. And then it helps. Parents don't always have time, and they don't always have time to read, you know, March or whatever the story might be. But I think that's part of it. And I think, you know, not every type of reading, there's a lot of things, right? So not every type of reading has to be, you know, a real book in any medium, you know, like I enjoy reading a great issue of X-Men as much as I enjoy reading the latest David Mitchell book. You know, they're different kinds of experiences. I think if I were to give any advice to parents in this sort of world, it's just to say, look, or caregivers, you know, like reading should be a vast experience. Reading should be a gateway to many worlds and many ways of acquiring information and many kinds of stories. And comics have a place in that. I mean, I've read thousands and thousands of comics. I've also read, have I read thousands of books? Maybe I've read thousands of you know, printed words only books. I don't know. I've read a lot of books, as have we all. And all of those things, from nonfiction to fiction to heavy genre to you know, to historical, to, you know, every type of story, every type of written material, every type of art has its place. And I think, you know, if a kid wants to read comics and that's what's getting them to read, let them read. You know, like if the alternative is, you know, forcing them to buy or forcing them to check out a book that they're never going to open because they don't care about it, like that's you're not winning there. You're failing, right? The idea is to get kids to read, and so let them read whatever they want within reason, and see what they like in the comic space. So if they're enjoying, you know, Bone, right? There's a lot of places you can go from Bone. There's a lot of fantasy novels you can go to from Bone that might be appealing. So I don't know, just it all just boils down to like being aware, you know, like understanding what your kid is reading, understanding why they like it, what they like about it, and then maybe talking to the librarian and saying, my child is loving Bone. Are there any prose books that you think might be nice? And so maybe they're like, well, you know, Lord of the Rings, maybe if they're a little more advanced, or The Hobbit is, you know, who knows, you know, whatever fantasy things they want to do.
Yeah, there's always plenty out there. There's more books out there than we can, you know, ever consume in a life. So
yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and so you alluded to this a little. People often think of terms of literacy, like as reading text only. Like you say, I've probably read thousands of books in my life, like just words. But what about, you know, visual literacy? And we're constantly inundated with images now. Like looking at, I mean, this is an image right now. Is Zoom a comic? I don't know. But so, like, what about the visual literacy and what role can comics play there, do you think?
I think, you know, the way that comics are magic, like the way that they do, I mean, and I'm not the first person to talk about these things, but the way that they use things like the gutters between panels and the way that I think either Alan Moore or Grant Morrison is the first person I encountered talking about this, but I can't imagine they made it up either. Like this goes back to the earliest days of sequential storytelling. But, you know, like the idea that in panel 1, you see someone holding a sandwich, and then in panel 2, that sandwich is half eaten, but they're still holding it, means that in that moment, in that gutter between the panels, they took bites of the sandwich, chewed it, and swallowed it. And then in the next panel, you know, they only have half the sandwich left. And that your mind doesn't have to translate that at all. It's just, it knows that that's what happened. It understands that. And it's this amazing way of filling in the blanks without thinking about it that is sort of unique to comics. And it's amazing. The page turn, the way that every page turn is a cliffhanger almost, like you don't know what's going to be on the next page in a comic, is a really neat thing. And you can play with sizes of panels and splashes that go across the fold. All of these wonderful tricks that make comics what they are, that absolutely translate into a more engaged brain that understands the world around us. Because, you know, we live in a visual universe. I mean, those, you know, the sighted anyway. And so using comics as a way to, I don't know, just experience the world, and certainly like experience the world through different eyes. Like a good comic, again, I keep saying March, I just think it's a great example of this. Like it's a way to, March, for anybody listening who doesn't know, is a series of graphic novels by Nate Powell and John Lewis, the recently deceased congressman, talking about his experiences with the civil rights movement. And it's really, really, really well done, but it lets you get into his head in a way that is very visceral and very connective, I think, for readers, particularly young readers, because that's an experience that most readers, like, they weren't there because they're too young. So they weren't in those experiences directly, but they can relate to them and connect to them and understand why they're important. And I think that is something that comics can do almost better than many other mediums, because they engage your eyes, they engage your reading muscles, they engage your, you know, just like multiple sensory inputs are happening at the same time. It's good.
Yeah, and I will never tell anyone to stop mentioning March. Like that is kind of the like pinnacle book to recommend right now, I think. And so thinking about, this is not one of my canned questions, but thinking about the pacing and the uniqueness of comics, like people often compare it to animation, but
sure,
in comics you're an active participant more than like watching a movie. And like, do you think that's part of why March might be more effective than sitting down a kid to watch, you know, a documentary about everything?
I do, because the reader, young or old, is experiencing it at their own pace. They are turning those pages. Their mind is actively filling in the gaps between the gutters and working that magic. And it's, you know, if you see a panel in, the really, really great comics are not just pictures and words and word balloons. They're musical, because the way that they use things like page layout, panel size, the way that you can turn a page and then it's a big double spread. They use the medium to bring the reader in and out, to have hugely impactful moments that land. And so let's say you're reading a comic that has nine panel grids, which is a very dense. So each page has 9 panels on it. It's very dense. You know, Watchmen used that trick. Mr. Miracle used that trick. Number of comics use it. So it's designed to be very sort of like locked in. It means like in the grid, panel. And then every once in a while, though, you turn the page and the grid has been exploded. It's not 9 small panels. It's one massive image that covers both pages. And usually those moments are like the hugely impactful bits of the story. But if you're reading the comic, as opposed to in a movie where the score is swelling and maybe it cuts into slow motion and there's like the kiss in the rain or the punching the bad guy or whatever the thing is, that moment has been curated for you by the filmmakers to last a certain amount of time, and then the story moves and goes, and they are choosing the pace. But if you're reading the comic and the 9-panel grid that's sort of closed in, your mind is in this sort of like closed in, locked in, small moments thing, and then goes to a massive moment, you can be like, you can take a breath, you can experience it, you can take all the time you want to look at the details of that moment, and you can keep going. And then if you want to, you can flip back to it. At any point, you can open the book 2 weeks later and look at that spread again, or that splash again if you want to. And that is unique to comics. Like even like listening to a wonderful song, it still is someone else choosing the pace and the way those moments are experienced. You don't really get to slow it down and live in a moment that's full of emotion and detail the way that comics let you do it. Prose can do it, but the addition of the visual element to comics makes it really, really powerful. It's a very special medium.
So turning to the creative bit a little bit, when you're in the process of, writing a script for a comic or writing your latest novel, do you ever think about the possibility of something getting challenged, and does that impact the way you approach it?
Yes, I do think about it. And part of it is like, there's a lot to think about when you're writing a story these days. And I think there should be a lot to think about, because you want to think about the chair in which you're sitting when you write a story. Brings with it all of your lived experience, good and bad, and your particular point of view, which is a strength as a writer. You should have a point of view, but you also need to understand that your point of view can be blinded. And the way that I see the world is very much based on the way I grew up in the world. And that's the way everybody is, okay? And so if you recognize, and there's this moment, I think, hopefully in every writer's life, when they realize that their experience is not universal. Their experience might be interesting, and it might be worth exploring, but it is certainly not the only way that the world is, and it's not the only way that other people experience the world. And so it's a moment, like, first you have the realization, and then you're like, okay, so what should I do with that now that I'm fully aware that my point of view is not the only one that matters, or like is even valid. Other people's opinions and ideas about things might be more valid than mine, because there are things I didn't see or understand about the world. And so then it's like, okay, so what do I do now? Do I just keep writing my own experience? Do I try to broaden my experience? Do I bring in other people's experiences to inform my work? Do I try to never write about any perspectives other than my own? These are important questions that I think a growing, mature writer should be wrestling with. And the earlier in your career you figure it out, the better. But you say, okay, this is who I am. This is my voice as a writer. There are other voices that are important. How do I bring in the experiences and ideas that are my own? And that's research, that's discussion, that is having other readers look at your work and say, okay, well, this doesn't really connect with the way that I saw the world. And then you have to make sure, and this is just the approach that I've come to, right? I think you don't want your experience to cause inadvertent choices in your work, right? I think if you're presenting a point of view in your work, you should always have a reason to do it. And it could be wrong, it might not connect with every reader, but if you can justify the choices that you made, the more times you make conscious choices about the points of view and perspectives that you're exploring, through research, through just, whatever, the better. The more well-informed your book seems. It's writing stories out of ignorance, being blinded, privilege, like it's not the way a mature writer should be handling it. So I kind of went down on a little bit of a tangent there, but I you know what, I'm kind of even like, I got so wrapped up in that, I'm sort of spacing what the actual question you asked was. Remind me again, make sure I answered it.
I was asking about if you ever think about the possibility of challenges to your work.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right.
I think that's it's a great tangent though.
Yeah. But that's why, right? That's why I think about that, because I know that one of the things that seems to cause challenges to work is, it's really two things in my opinion, right? One is if you're writing about material that is not generally accepted as okay for community standards or whatever environment you're putting the work into. A community decides that they don't think that what you're doing is appropriate or good. So that's sort of like you're making a conscious choice about it, and that it's off color for one reason or another, but you're going to do it anyway. But then the other reason works get challenged is because you screw up. You do not approach it from a mature perspective. You don't take your blinders off. You don't understand. You don't realize that you maybe need to understand more about the perspectives you're trying to write before you write them. And so I am always aware of the former, right? When, the idea of I'm writing about subject matter here that not everybody's going to like, for just to give you an example, like I'm writing, Hong Kong is a working on my next novel now. So I wrote Oracle, Year, and Anyone, and then my next novel, Light of the Jedi, it's a Star Wars book. It launches this whole new Star Wars thing, which I'm very excited about. That comes out January 5th. But then the next book after that is another book for Harper, and it is set not entirely, but largely in Hong Kong, which is the place that I lived growing up for a while. So I've always wanted to set a book there, but Hong Kong is changing very, very rapidly now, like day by day by day. And it's not in the news as much because our news cycle is insane, but I know people there, and it is increasingly becoming just a very, very different place than I've known for the last, long time, like 30 years I've known Hong Kong. And I wanted to write about the Hong Kong that I know, but that Hong Kong is gone, or is rapidly going to be gone. So my choice was to write about that one anyway, and just sort of write kind of the old Hong Kong, or write the new Hong Kong. And I'm choosing to write the new Hong Kong, but I am also certain that will mean I will probably not sell this book. Like, this book will not get a foreign rights deal in China. And that's okay. You know, it's fine. I still think the story should be told the way, like, I'm not going to make a decision based on that. But you know, there's always things you think about, like, oh, should I go here? Should I talk about this? And then it's just a balance between the community and your sense of integrity and self as a writer. And sometimes the story is more important than people's reaction to it, you know? But it's always about making those choices consciously. I don't want to ever be caught out and realize, oh man, I never thought about that. I was so in my own head or in my own self that I never thought about the way this was going to be received. So, which is tricky.
And that's, splitting those up is really interesting, because overwhelmingly the books that are on the list that ALA compiles of banned and challenged books are the ones where the community issued a complaint about it. Some parent, some teacher, some library worker decided that it wasn't appropriate for their community or age group, and so they try to get it removed. I don't know that ALA tracks so much the other one where there's a genuine, like, error in the story about an experience or a culture's experience of the world. Those don't show up as we see those on social media more, I think.
Yeah, sure. Cancellation, all of that.
Yeah. That's a whole rabbit hole that we will not go into.
No, but look, I agree. I don't really want to go into that, but I think that a correction is happening, like a sort of self-correction is happening to the way that stories are being told and written, and most importantly, the way that stories are being thought about by their creators. And I think that is a wonderful thing. It makes the job harder. Oh man, you have to actually think about what you're saying. You have to think about the other people that you're writing about. You can't just, sit there and type and be thrilled. You have to. It is important to try to reflect the world in a way that is, like, not harmful and is not. I think I think it's a good change. It is there's a struggle, because any significant change causes, there's pain, growing pains, right? Whatever. But I think that the shift toward a kind of more conscious authorship in general is a good thing.
No arguments here. Let's see. Why do you think it's important that libraries continue to include comics, graphic novels, as part of their collection, especially, or even in face of challenges?
I mean, well, first of all, because I have made a lot of them, and I would like my stuff to stay in libraries. But as somebody who's worked in comics professionally for a decade, God, more than that, more than a decade. I know and loved them for my whole life before that. I know how deep and rewarding the experience of comics can be to readers. They are, they are gateways to different kinds of storytelling. They are wonderful in and of themselves, whether it's, whether it's an X-Men comic or a David Mitchell book. Like, comics are incredible experiences that should be part of the reading curriculum. I don't think there's any, like, I actually would say, like, you wouldn't have a library that doesn't have a section, like a mysteries section. You wouldn't have a library that doesn't have, doesn't stock audiobooks, or doesn't have, nonfiction. Like these are things that are considered fundamental to reading and to the dissemination of information and stories. And I think comics and graphic novels are exactly the same. Like having a library that does not have that is ignoring a massive part of reading for millions and millions and billions of people across the world. So that's the first thing. As far as challenged ones, as far as, why should libraries stock books that are challenging or have been specifically challenged in a community? First of all, I think it's kind of a library's responsibility to do that anyway. A library is a sacred thing. And I know that it can be hard, and I know that libraries can get flack for stocking stuff that parents or different people in a community don't like, but I don't think it's the library's job to do that. I think the library's job is to make content available, is to make stories available to their readers. And I just don't like, I don't know. It goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, right? I think every story has a reader, every story has a place. And so if you choose to say this 8-year-old can't read Preacher, and so it shouldn't be in the library, on the off chance an 8-year-old gets it, it means that a 22-year-old who might get a lot out of Preacher and might, connect. Preacher is one of my favorite stories in comics I've ever read. It was very formative for me. Or even like Sandman, right? Like Neil Gaiman's Sandman, or some of the more challenging Alan Moore works, or just whatever. Like we could go on. Like there's a lot that when you're reading those in your 20s, they can be massively formative for you, or your teens. Whereas if you're reading those when you're 7 or 8, you might just be like, whoa, this is crazy. I'm not like, this is too much for me. But making the community, if a library says we're not going to have Sandman because on the off chance an 8-year-old looks at it, that means that the 17-year-old who would be changed by it in a good way can't get it. So I think the answer is never to not stock the challenging stories. I think the answer is to find solutions that allow those stories to find audiences that are sort of ready for them. Which is hard. I know it's hard, but that's
And it's various levels of difficult depending on your kind of library and your state location and all of that sort of thing. Sure. Like in an academic setting, I can stock what I want and people can deal with it. In a K through 12 library, it's a little more complicated. So one last question from me before I'll start trying to dig into the Q&A.
Okay.
You have a background in law,
yes.
So I'm curious if you have any recommendations or insights you could share for libraries about how to deal with challenges or calls for bans. I'm also curious if that influences your own work as a separate.
The law stuff, yeah. Okay, so I will answer the second question first, which is whether having a legal background influences my own work. It absolutely does. I mean, I did a really long run on Daredevil. I did a very noted run on She-Hulk, both of whom are attorney characters. I love writing about the law and telling stories that involve the law more than I liked practicing it. I actually, which is not to say that I didn't like being a full-time attorney. I did. I worked primarily in immigration, which was a very rewarding field. And I did well. I was good at it. I helped plenty of people change their lives in positive ways. I really did like it, but I like telling stories more. So now it's nice because I think that the law is the sort of the infrastructure of society. It's the girders behind the skyscraper or within the skyscraper of society. And so understanding the way that the law shapes and moves and changes and is bent and broken, and all of the things that laws do within our society gives you a real sense of the underpinnings and why this country and other countries, why we all kind of work the way we do. So I'm fascinated by it. I love writing about it. And I use it all the time. So it also gave me a real sense of discipline and focus, because when you're working on a legal brief or something, you kind of just have to sit down and work until it's done, whether that's 8 hours or 4 days. And so being able to just sit down and type for extended periods of time has been, I think the law career gave me some of that. So in terms of how libraries can deal with challenges, obviously this is not legal advice, and even more, every jurisdiction is different and has its own rules about obscenity and censorship. I mean, there's the famous obscenity ruling, I don't know, I can't define obscenity, but I certainly know it when I see it. You know, like that is how challenges and all of that go, because it is very community based. It's really like libraries operate within the community in which they're built, and every community is a little bit different, and every community has a sense of what's appropriate that's a little bit different, and it is certainly a push and pull between, you know, the needs of certain members of the community, or the desires of certain members of the community, and the needs and desires of other members of the community who believe in you know, all information and stories should be free and available to everybody. So I think that personally, I mean, I think that the overarching goal for a library should be to let the library do its job. I don't think that outside influences should necessarily be part of it. I realize that libraries can be under a lot of pressure because there's funding, there's like all kinds of stuff that they have to think about and consider. But I think the default position is we know what we're doing. We understand how to provide material and content. We spend a lot of time on it. We are literally experts in this field. We will make sure that your 7-year-old is not reading Preacher if you're worried about that. But if the community refuses to allow that, then it becomes sort of a push and pull between the needs of the facility, right, of the library itself, because the worst thing, you do not want a library to have to close its doors. And so, you know, sometimes you have to bend a little bit and figure out ways to do it. Maybe you put Preacher under, you know, in a cabinet in the back, and it has to be special requested. I don't know, but like, I think it's the whatever choices are made by the library should be whatever the community kind of needs. But at the same time, if those choices can be made with an eye toward keeping material available for appropriate readers, that's always the best way to do it. Like, find solutions that are compromises as opposed to, okay, we just won't stop this book anymore.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's see some of these questions. As a reminder, if you have any, drop them in the Q&A, and I'll try to look at the chat. I think I saw a couple there too. Jonathan asks, any tips on getting other librarians, library administration to take comics more seriously and treat them like quote unquote real books?
Real books. You know, like I said, I think that there are books that get, you know, like the New York Times does write-ups on significant comics all the time. And to bring up March again, March has gotten tons of coverage in the New York Times, and not as a work of like, oh, here's a fun Superman story. It's as like, this is a massive culturally significant work. And there are many other comics that have been covered in you know, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it. Comics are taught in university courses as scholarly works. I mean, I think there's a lot, like, I think the argument that comics are not important, that comics are stories that are somehow less than, is, I'm surprised to think that we're still talking about it in 2020, because there's been so much incredible, award-winning, stirring, beautifully done, you know, and selling, like Ryan Telgemeier. Like, I don't know that there's a kid in this country that hasn't read those books. Yeah. And you read them and you know that it's not like Captain America punching Red Skull. You know, there's nothing wrong with Captain America punching Red Skull, but these are books about the experiences that children are having. These are you know, universal, clearly universal, because she sold like 20 million copies of them, like millions and millions of copies sold and checked out at libraries all over the world. Like, those are stories that children connect with and get great value from. And so, and those are geared toward whatever, 7 to 11-year-olds. But then there's the next set of comics that are geared, or graphic novels that are geared to 11 to 15-year-olds. And then there's the 15 to 18, and then there's on up. So they are written material that connects with people, that educates, that inspires, that entertains, that does everything good books or every kind of good story is supposed to do. So if you don't stock them in your library, I just, you know, it's like I said, you know, you wouldn't not have a nonfiction section. You wouldn't not have a mystery section. Same reason. There's no reason not to have a comic section.
Yeah. And real quick, my answer to that tends to be, if all of that fails, I like to turn to and go, I stock a collection of comics in a medical school. If medicine can do comics effectively, then your public library can too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Angel made a comment about Neil Gaiman mentioning that comics are a medium that's mistaken for a genre. And he specifically mentioned loving the format because it could allow him to have a panel without any text at all, which is impossible in a standard book. I think that connects back to what you're saying about you wouldn't not have audiobooks or you wouldn't not have movies or something. Like comics are, it's like eliminating an entire other format from your collection to not have them.
Yeah, and and stories are stories, and it's like if there's a reader who only is interested in reading comics, but yet they're interested in reading, and you have a library that doesn't have any comics, they're going to be like, okay, well then this place is not for me, which to me seems foolish. Why would you ever turn away a reader, ever, under any circumstances? It goes against the entire sort of reason for libraries to exist. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for libraries to exist, but certainly making people read and helping people read is one of them.
Absolutely. I think this is Franco asking, going back to the question on quote unquote real books, I often encounter patrons who strictly think of comics as superhero only and then get disturbed by other genres or books outside the big two that delve into deep issues. Since Charles has written across media and genre, what to do about overcoming this very specific and odd objection to comics?
That's a tricky one, because in my feeling is that the easiest way to overcome that is to have them read one of the other, like get hooked on Saga or whatever the book is, or Undiscovered Country, to name one of my own, like whatever the story is that would make them see, okay, yes, comics are not just superheroes, but that's not a bad thing. That's in fact a plus. That's a feature, not a bug. I mean, I think that's the only tactic that really pops to mind is to have a book in your back pocket, not literally, maybe literally, but like a book that you can say, okay, look, I know you think it's Batman, you think it's Daredevil, but they can do some other really, really cool things too. And here's what I would suggest for you. And here's what I would suggest for your kid. And then you don't have to know every single comic, but if you have those two things in mind, here's the thing I recommend to grownups, here's the thing I recommend to kids, and like have one for, the three or four different age ranges, then, it's fine. But you can't change everybody's mind either. I think people, whenever you're trying to convince somebody of something they're convinced they can never believe, just, be excited about your own perspective and sort of be like, don't try to force somebody to believe something. Just be like, this is what's happened to me. This is how it was for me. Maybe it'd be like that for you.
Yeah. Kathleen asks, do you think the go at your own pace factor is part of the reason why more YA graphic novels and comics are handling weightier subjects, i.e. They Called Us Enemy by George Sakai, Displacement by Hiku Hughes, etc.?
I do, and I think there have been like manga that have handled some really, really intense subject matter. Like early on, like I know that like the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings and their after effects were explored in many, 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 many ways in very dense manga, like years before that stuff sort of started to happen here. And Mouse is another good example. I don't know. I think that it's, I mean, comics can just be anything. Like I'm thinking now, like I get overwhelmed by the sheer number of brilliantly done stories. But getting back to the question that's actually asked. So in terms of the go at your own pace, I do think so. I think that, if there's a disturbing moment or a moment that's challenging in one way, a growth moment, an experiential moment in a comic, I do think giving a reader, particularly a young reader, the ability to experience and let that settle and think about it and go back and look at it again. You know, you're like, wow, I can't get that panel out of my head. You flip back 10 pages and look at it again. Like I do that now. Like I'll read a comic of like, you know, a 22-page comic, and then I'll go back and flip through it sometimes just to think about some of the stuff that struck me from it. So they're just, comics are a magical thing. There's nothing else like them. There's a reason they've been around for us. I mean, cave paintings are comics, and I'm not the first person to say that, but that's what they are. Like in the earliest versions of our storytelling, we made comics basically. So they've always been with us. There's a reason they stick with us, even though we have Avengers Endgame and all these versions of the stories that are supposedly better in some way. Like comics are a really clearly effective way to tell and experience stories.
Jake's commenting, I think, as a public librarian working with teachers, school library staff, I've been able to help them find value and growing into graphic novels with Jerry Craft's New Kid and Hey Kiddo by Jarek Krasaska, both of which are fantastic and highly recommended. But at the moment, I don't have any more audience questions, so I'll take my prerogative and ask you one last one for me.
Sure.
I'm curious, because you do your own creator-owned work in comics and also work for possibly the biggest media company in the world with Star Wars work, how do you approach those two differently? Like,
I mean, the base answer is there are many more rules in working for Star Wars than there are in writing my own novel and my own creator-owned stuff. But at the same time, there are advantages to working, say, in Star Wars that are not like as available when I'm telling my own stories. And the biggest one is that if I have Darth Vader show up in a story, almost virtually every single person reading that story immediately knows who he is, what he means, his impact, his history, how this is going to change the other characters, how other characters are probably going to react to him, all of those things. And you're like excited because there's been so many other awesome Darth Vader stories told by other creators in all these different mediums that I have all of their work behind me pushing my Darth Vader story forward. Which is great. It also means that there's the pressure of George Lucas's Darth Vader is sort of standing right behind my Darth Vader saying, all right, you better make this good. So that's sort of the plus and minus of that. Whereas writing my own stories, whether they're Letter 44 or curse words or my novels, I can do anything that I want, but I can make choices that are in some ways more daring. Like if I had my own Darth Vader, I could murder that Darth Vader on page 2 if I chose to, or whatever the thing is that I felt like was important to do for my story. But you have to hook the reader and you have to keep the reader in ways that are different than different than if you were doing it yourself. Sorry, I saw a question pop up on the screen and distracted me as well. What was Darth Vader's karaoke song?
Yep.
So I'm trying to think what the answer that would be. But let me just wrap up this. So basically, when you're telling your own stories, it is a real tightrope act to make sure that you have to build all of that engagement from scratch. And if you're an experienced author, like Stephen King has some buy-in because he's been doing it for so long and so effectively. Neil Stephenson, David Mitchell. Again, I'm reading David Mitchell's new book right now, which is why he's in my head. Utopia Avenue is fantastic. So. It's all on you. You don't have 40 or 70 or 80 years of other people's stories to help you out, but that is exhilarating and it's free and it's a really, really cool thing to do. So I intend to keep doing both for some time to come, both the big licensed stuff and my own stories, and hopefully forever. I don't mind bouncing back and forth between them.
Great. Do you have an answer for Henry's question?
Yeah. I think it probably would be Johnny Cash, some Johnny Cash song.
Hurt seems like a good one to me.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
Hurt is a cover, of course.
I think Ring of Fire, could be.
Fire, yeah.
Could make sense. But obviously Johnny Cash was the Man in Black, so as is Darth Vader. So I think that they probably it'd be something like that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me and answering some serious questions, some fun questions.
Yeah.
I think now I'm supposed to call Brandy back up to do a little bit of wrap up.
Okay.
Or
I think
Franco, maybe.
Yes. Well, thank you both, Charles and Matthew, for joining us today. I think this was a great, nuanced, and kind of deep dive into some bits of censorship that I think were really insightful for all of us. So thank you both. And this is our last Banned Book Week webinar this week. But I hope, especially this webinar particularly, it maybe inspires you to go home this week and this weekend and tonight and maybe read a banned comic. I think it would certainly be appropriate. But thanks to everyone that made this week possible, our friends at IFRT, the many people behind the scenes at GNCRT that helped make this happen, our friends at Image Comics, Chloe Ramos especially, who, a lot of this would not have been possible without her help. And of course, Brandy, who helped co-organize these. But thank you, everyone. I hope you had fun. I know I enjoyed this conversation especially. So have a good week, and we'll see you in over the winter for Freedom to Read Week, and of course next year for Banned Books Week again.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.